My take is that you're absolutely correct. There is growing momentum in the business community around carbon pricing, but also around working with business to try to make sure that we actually can transition to a low carbon economy. We've been through the Prince of Wales Corporate Leaders Group for the last 10 years working on these issues, so it's really nice to be joined by so many other businesses. I think we felt in the beginning that we were really the pioneers who were sticking our necks out and not only calling for market mechanisms through our carbon pricing communique, but also trying to figure out what type of legislation we need to put in place. In the UK, of course, we had the Climate Act. In Europe, we started with the 2020 Climate and Energy Package. And so now to see that actually there are so many more businesses, and as you say, we saw it in Paris at the Business and Climate Summit, CEOs from very different sectors, the oil and gas sector, as well as some of the energy intensives, as well as the usual suspects, coming together and indicating that actually, yes, we need to start to think about this seriously and how we can actually reach our 2-degree goal.
There still seems to be a bit of nervousness. Everyone looks like they're sort of standing on the edge and peering down, and they're saying the right things, but they aren't necessarily following it up with action. What's that going to take over the next 6 months to really start to see companies sort of following up what they're promising to do?
It is nerve-wracking. It's nerve-wracking for shareholders, it's nerve-wracking for CEOs and for entire companies. Trying to totally change your business model to integrate externalities and take into consideration whether it be carbon pricing or other externalities is not easy business. So it does mean that you're going to have to invest. It does mean that you have to look at long-term plans. It also means that we need to make sure we have the signal from governments. And so although there's a great deal of business momentum, I think many of us are slightly trepidatious in terms of what type of signals are we truly going to have from the rest of the world. We know that Europe has continuously been a leader. That leadership has now been joined through China and the United States. Mexico and other countries are definitely coming to the plate to try to demonstrate that they also want to be a leader. But there are many countries out there, and these are all multinationals that have to do business across different countries, and they want to make sure they have similar signals. They can't just go into niche markets and develop certain products or certain processes for certain markets. It's much easier to have a clear signal across the globe indicating that we are transitioning to a low-carbon economy.
Why do you think governments are not then wholeheartedly backing this call for a carbon price? There was a lot of noise in Paris last week. We had the World Bank release a report this morning. I think they said that there were 40 countries which are operating some form of carbon pricing mechanism. It's worth 50 billion, but it's still quite a small amount when you look at the whole world, and I think it's something like 14 to 15% of global greenhouse emissions. So, why do you think the governments around the world aren't necessarily following this up?
I think that it's quite amazing that we've gotten to where we are actually in the last year, and I'd like to commend the World Bank, who we're working with directly on the coalition to try to ensure that we get more countries. I think that because carbon pricing is not always so simple, because clearly it does impact different businesses differently, and so there is some not necessarily animosity, but lack of understanding across all governments as to what this actually means for their country. We hosted a panel this morning with Christiana Figueres, with the World Bank, and also the Minister of Environment of Spain. And it was very clear from that conversation that we need to make sure that we tailor-make our solutions for different countries. It may be that carbon pricing is not perfect for all economies, and therefore we need to look at possibilities of taxation. We need to look at other mechanisms. I think the other thing too that we have to be very clear about, we are at the Carbon Expo, and last week we talked a lot about carbon pricing. But there needs to be a balance of instruments that we put in place in order to decarbonize. We have to have strong standards, we have to have strong legislation. We also need to ensure that we bring in the finance community in order to, and the treasuries in order to ensure that we have the revenue to make this transition happen.
One thing I thought was interesting that Figueres said was that she talked a bit about lobbyists and saying it's important for companies to make sure that they have the right lobbyists or they're part of the right groups. And I think there's one group in America, ALEC, which a few companies have already left because it's promoting probably, you might say, climate skeptical views. As a kind of a lobbyist yourself, are you winning the battle? Are you losing? What's the kind of balance of power at the moment?
So I try not to actually label myself as a lobbyist. I think we try to work on partnerships rather than lobbying. But it's a difficult one because I tend to agree. There are certain associations in Europe and the United States that actually have been pushing forward issues rather than solutions, and that have indicating that transitioning is too difficult for most business. And they really don't represent the business voice anymore. What we continuously say at the Prince of Wales Corporate Leaders Group, and also with the Green Growth Platform and other large business groups that we work with through We Mean Business, is that we've moved on. And what we need to do is not just lobby, but actually work with governments to try to find solutions. The complexities are there. This is not easy. It's not easy for energy intensives or energy companies to transition as fast as maybe renewable providers or energy efficiency providers who are now starting to move onto the market. We need to find a room for everything, and that's the other actually very clear signal from Christiana this morning at our panel discussion, was that we cannot ostracize either companies or countries. We must work with the oil and gas sector. We must work with the coal sector. We need to bring them on the journey. Is that easy? No, not necessarily. They have very different issues to the retail sector, for example. And what we've always said is, by working together through different sectors and with different governments, we'll be much stronger in finding the right solutions.
Just on that point, because you mentioned the fossil fuel companies, and Corporate Leaders Group has got a really interesting group of members. I think it includes EDF, Shell. From your experience, what have you learnt from working with major oil companies or major energy producers? Because there are a lot of critics out there who say, a leopard won't change its spots. They'll say something about carbon pricing, but behind the scenes they're still drilling in the Arctic or whatever. What's your sort of comeback to that argument?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right that we need to make sure that the companies that we work with are not speaking with a forked tongue. And we are constantly being looked at by NGOs and by others to make sure that we actually are practicing what we are preaching. Again, the complexity is the fact that some companies like Shell are very much promoting carbon pricing, promoting actually an emissions trading scheme in Europe. They are a leader actually in Europe in terms of the oil and gas sector. And yet we have been very vocal to them at the very highest level, and also in working and speaking to NGOs, that some of their practices are not acceptable. And so we need to try to find a balance. How do you bring them in? I think that they are feeling the pressure. I think there are many of the oil and gas companies that are starting to realize, and we heard this last week, but we're hearing it more in the board rooms as well, that they realize that they actually need to move away from just focusing on their fossil fuel reserves, from just continuously focusing on drilling. If we can give them options for diversification, if we can look at not just divestment, but positive investment in order to stimulate finance flows so that we do bring these energy companies on board, working with the coal sector, for example, on abatement of emissions, I think that then we'll be able to move quite fast. Let's not forget that the IEA has been very clear in terms of the energy use predictions that we will continue to use fossil fuels for quite some time. Not bringing them in the short and medium term as part of the solution is actually, I think, a real mistake.